Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you again today to study with us in the book of Ezekiel. We're going to be studying chapter 39, which is the second chapter of a two-chapter, what I call a unit of chapter 38 and 39, which is a study of what I totally believe is an account of what's going to happen in the big war at the end of the millennium, when Satan is released and sin is totally vanquished. Let me just preface my remarks by saying that my belief is that I am totally comfortable with the belief that this account, or these prophecies have to do with that war that I just mentioned, the one at the end of it's what I call the war to end all wars. It's the last war that's ever going to be fought. And I know that there are several different views, but I think I can explain my position totally and completely, right down to in chapter 38 for sure, right down to the point where Satan is released. I believe that even when Satan is released at the end of the 1,000-year reign, or at the end of the millennium, I believe that that is taken account of in chapter 38 of Ezekiel. And I think that's almost a game ender right there. That just seems like it's something you can't get out of any other understanding of what these scriptures apply to. I believe that chapter 39 is part of the same event, and it has to do with the cleanup of the war that was fought in chapter 38. We get some of the same prophecies. So I just wanted to make that comment to you because it is important, and I believe that this is the only, except for the chapter 20 of Revelation, I believe this is the only place in the Bible where that war is prophesied. So anyway, let's get right on into it. We're going to be in chapter 39 today. The first 16 verses have to do with the magnitude of Gog's defeat. You know, he has this war that he fights in his own mind. He has this idea that he can defeat Jesus Christ, and he suffers the consequences of that belief when he goes to war with him. So let's go ahead and start. Let's look at the first two verses. Let me read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 39. Son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Verse 2, I will turn you around and drag you along. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. All right. Once again, these are the words of God. They are not the words of Ezekiel. Ezekiel just didn't dream this up on his own, decided to write it down. God gave him these prophecies, and he records them, and we are the beneficiaries of that, getting to read into the ideas of that God has, what's incorporated in his name, how he treats his name, what he thinks about his name, and how it has been profaned through the centuries. Okay, so in verse 1, Gog is the leader of an evil coalition of forces that God sends against the mountains of Israel. God sends him. It's much like what happened when Babylon was sent by God to chasten, to be the rod of discipline against Israel and their idolatry and spiritual apostasy. So he sends Gog to fight against Israel. You note here in chapter 39, verse 1, that Gog has the same name and the same title as that of chapter 38, verse 3. We won't go back and look at it. He's called the Prince of Meshach and Tubal. Many people believe that this has to do with Russia. For the sake of our discussion, it doesn't really matter, I suppose. It would be impossible to know, but we do know that the stuff that's going on in here is from forces from the far north of Israel, and Moscow is immediately due north of Jerusalem. So God will bring him from the far north, and verse 2 says that God says he, meaning himself, God will himself turn them around and drag them along. It's much like what they said in chapter 38, verse 4, where he talked about God will put a hook in his jaw. God is in control. It's all his doing. He's going to use this army that's being assembled against Israel to put the ultimate defeat on sin. Okay, verses 3 and 4. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. Verse 4, on the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. I will give you, that's his allies, I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and to the wild animals. All right, in verse 3, God says he will take his weapons from the bow in his left hand to the arrows in his right. Now, if we want to, what we said last week in terms of principles of interpretation, you interpret literal where literal makes sense, or where you can do that. Well, this is modern day times. We don't fight wars on horseback anymore. So this is going to have to be interpreted as modern day weapons, but an army, a vast army nonetheless. I heard just the other day, it was either Chuck Missler or another man that said you could consider a bow as a launcher and an arrow as a missile of some sort, if that would make you feel any better. But what that would do is bring those weapons up to modern day standards. I'm not saying you need to do that. I'm just saying that this is a war being fought, and it's going to be fought with the weapons of the day. Verse 4, it says he will fall on the mountains of Israel. He will be killed. God will drag his army to a stunning defeat. We're going to see what that means here in just a minute. They will be clobbered, basically. They're going to be clobbered. Verse 2 in King James, this is interesting. Just something I want to point out if you're reading King James, or if somebody tells you this, or you see it on TV or whatever. But verse 2 of King James says that 5/6 of God's army will be killed. That's not in the ESV. It's not in the NASB. It's not in the NIV. It's not in any mainline translation that I could read. But I want to read it that I found. But I want to read it to you out of the King James so you know what I'm talking about. King James chapter 39 verse 2 says this: and I will return thee back and leave but the 6th part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. I'm going to bring you to the mountains of Israel, and 5/6 of your army is going to be destroyed. That qualifies as being clobbered. So what I have come to understand is that 1/6 is from a mistranslation, but that's the only, King James is the only version that I found that has that in it. That is not to say that the deeper meaning is clobbered. He's going to be clobbered, and God is the one that's going to do it. Okay, their bodies will be offered to the birds and wild animals, similar to that of chapter 19 of Revelation, verses 17 and 18. this is the verse that influences some to think that chapter 38 and 39 is a combination of two wars. It's got Armageddon, and this would be talking about Armageddon according to these people, but Armageddon and the war at the end of the millennium with a 1,000-year pause in the middle. So what would happen in a belief like that, Gog is defeated according to what we're saying here. Gog would be defeated at Armageddon, and then he would be reconstituted, and we'd have another man named Gog that would come up to fight this war at the end of in chapter 20 of Revelation, which is what I'm saying is chapter 38 and 39 of Ezekiel. So this would be a partial fulfillment. It could happen twice. It could happen twice, or it could be the same event, and I'm saying it's the same event. It's impossible to know, I suppose, but I feel like there's enough detail here to know that this applies to the war at the end of Revelation, where when Satan is released from captivity, where he's been for 1,000 years. But I want to point out to you that just because there's some detail in one prophecy and less or more detail in another prophecy does not invalidate one of those prophecies. For example, when we read in Revelation, let's see. I don't want to read it at the wrong time here. Well, we'll just see. But God progressively, or I say progressively, it doesn't have to be progressive. It can be however he wants to do it. But you get in this account of the war, we see things that are not in the account in chapter 20 of Revelation. Well, as I said, it doesn't invalidate it. God gives more or less detail as he sees fit for us to grab understanding as we're doing our personal study. Okay, so I'm just saying that the fact that the bodies are given over to the birds of carrion, birds of prey, buzzards and the like, to eat the bones and eat the meat off the bones, is not in the account of Revelation 20. But what I'm saying is that does not invalidate Ezekiel 38 and 39 as being applicable to that war. Okay, so let's look at verse 5 and 6. Chapter 39. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastlands, and they will know that I am the Lord. Okay, so God will be destroyed, and his army, his homeland, and the surrounding coastlands. And those surrounding coastlands would apparently be where some of Gog's allies are located. I believe the Gaza Strip is along the coastlands. They would be allies of anybody that wants to destroy Israel. So I don't know if that's the place we're talking about, but that is some coastlands, and it's where some enemies of Israel are currently living. They are under some sort of protection, but these are not Jews. Even though it says that they're living in safety, there's some kind of protection going on. It's not the kind of safety that's provided by Jesus Christ being on site, like he will be during the millennium. And so the fire is falling way north of Jerusalem. Okay, let's look at verses 7 and 8. It says, I will send fire on Magog. Well, Magog is the location of where Gog is from, and that is an area that we believe, according to what it says here, that it's north of Israel. It would be one of the countries up there. You know, some people want to say it's Russia, but what I'm saying is it doesn't really matter. We just know there's a country and a coalition of forces coming against Israel. This fire is going to be rained down on the north of Israel, Gog's homeland. Okay, so let's look at verse 7 and 8. I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I, the Lord, am the Holy One of Israel. In verse 8, it is coming. It is coming. It will surely take place, declares the sovereign Lord. This is the day I have spoken of. All right. Okay, through this single act of war, God will vindicate his name, and everyone will know that he is the Holy One of Israel. You know what I've told you? Well, first of all, God has been complaining, and he has been judging Israel on the way his name has been profaned by the nations, which Israel can't control, but they profane his name in their worship practices. And this is what all of this war with Babylon was about. And of course, they suffered the consequences of that war and captivity for centuries and are still feeling the effects of it. But God says, you're going to know when this is done, it's coming, and you're going to know when it's done that I'm the Lord. It means it's being done in such a way. What have I told you? It's being done in such a way that you're going to know that it was God that did it. It says the nations are going to know and Israel's going to know. I love verse 8. It says, it is coming. That means certainty. That means if you're Jewish, the word is for certainty is hayah, H-A-Y-A-H. If you're from Spain or Mexico, it is certeza. That means certainty. And if you're from the United States or any English-speaking country, it is certainty. This is the day I have spoken of, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. I presume that would be the way you describe it. But it is going to happen with certainty. In verse 8, it said, I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I am the Lord. So that's every nation. That's the nations that are not Israel. So that's why I gave you those different words for a couple of three different countries that would be used for certainty. So everybody's going to be using that word. Okay, verses 9 and 10. Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up. The small and the large shields and the bows and the arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel. Okay, the people in the towns of Israel will gather up the weapons. You know, Gog's army is going to be clobbered. Their bodies are going to be left laying in the fields, and so are their weapons. Well, they go out and gather these weapons. Remember, all the weapons that we mentioned were small and large shields, bows and arrows, war clubs and spears. We know that from chapter 38, verses 4 through 6. And they're going to burn those things for 7 years. They're going to use the weapons for 7 years. That's not 7 years of the Great Tribulation. Regardless of how you look at this, the tribulation has already occurred, so it can't be that. It's going to take a heap of arrows, a heap of shields, and a heap of bows, and so on and so on, and helmets and all that stuff. It's going to take a heap of those things to burn for 7 years. Some people have said that if we're talking about modern implements of war, which they would gather up, it would be nuclear, it could be oil, gasoline, all kinds of things like that. Some people want to say nuclear. I really haven't given it much thought. But they will plunder, it says, from those who planned to plunder them. That's one of the things God was going to do. We're going to plunder you. Well, guess what? You're going to be plundered. Okay, this is one of the things that makes prophecy difficult. This is the kind of this is the kind of thing that makes prophecy difficult. If this is the war to end all wars, is what I'm saying, and the new heaven and the new earth come after the war at the end of the millennium, how can this take 7 years? If the new heaven and the new earth, let's see if I want to read something about that yet. It takes 7 years to burn up all that stuff. If it takes 7 years and the heaven and new earth come immediately after the millennium, how does this 7-year period of burning stuff fit into it? Why is it being done and that sort of thing? Well, I'm not just trying to make things fit. I'm just saying this could be a problem if you want to insist on the new heaven and new earth coming. I mean, it's not the new heaven and new earth. I think it's actually the great white throne judgment. Let me just go back and look. Yeah, this says, let's just go ahead and look at it. It says in chapter 20 of Revelation, verse 11, immediately after this war, and Satan has been thrown into the lake of fire, it says, then I saw a great white throne, and it goes through the great white throne judgment. That makes it sound like it happens immediately. You know, like we throw Satan into the lake of fire, then we go down the hall and we have the great white throne judgment. It makes it sound like it's an immediate occurrence. It doesn't have to be an immediate occurrence. It says, I've completed the judgment of Satan. Now I'm going to complete the judgment of the great white throne. But it doesn't, it just says then. So we know it follows. We don't know how close after. We're going to see that there's a cleansing process that's going to be going on in chapter 39. And this burning of these weapons may be part of that. It may be, for whatever reason, they're being burned to use for fuel. But we don't know for certain that the great white throne judgment happens immediately after. And then after the great white throne judgment, it says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth coming down. That makes it sound like immediately after the great white throne judgment, the new heaven and the new earth come down. It doesn't have to be. There can be time lapses in there. We just don't know. It's one of those things where we have no detail between those, and Ezekiel just fills in some of that. We're seeing these weapons being burned. We're going to see some more part of the cleansing process in just a few minutes, just a few verses. Okay, so the fact that we get detail in one prophecy that is not in another prophecy sometimes give people a little reason for doubt, a little reason for puzzlement, and that sort of thing. Okay, I have to be fair in my teaching though, but I just can't see this being Armageddon. I just can't see it. We've had tons of detail about Armageddon, and this just fits perfectly with what it says in chapter 20 about the war at the end of the millennium. Okay, let's look at verse 11, chapter 39. On that day, I give Gog a burial place in Israel. Now see, that on that day is different than the word then. It says on that day. That is a specific time when something happens. On that day, I will give Gog a burial place in Israel in the valley of those who travel east of the sea. That's east. It will block the way of travelers because Gog and all of his soldiers will be buried there. So it will be called the Valley of Hamon Gog. So they're gonna find that this is some valley doesn't say what valley. I suppose the fact that it doesn't give a name means that the point of this prophecy, it's not an important place to be specifically naming. They travel eastward towards the Dead Sea. Well, I've already made this comment. The fact that it happens in a valley is important, but which valley we're talking about is not. Then verse 12. Okay, verse 12 says this: for 7 months, or we had the 7 years, we talk about gathering up weapons and burning them, using for fuel for 7 years. Here we're saying, verse 12, for 7 months, the Israelites will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. So they're going to be burying bodies for 7 months. Okay, so the devastation, there's so many bodies, it's going to take 7 months to bury them all. But why even bury them? Why bother? Why even bury them? Probably, it's probably mostly bones after the birds and the animals got through with them. They're going to bury the dead. And they're going to be doing it to cleanse the land, it says there at the end of verse 11. I'm sorry. Yeah, at the end of verse 11 it says that. And unburied corpses are considered unclean, and burying must be done as soon as possible after death. So you got all these bodies laying around, and they've got to be taken care of before people can pass, so as to not to be spiritually contaminated. In verse 13 and 14 say this: all the people of the land will bury them, and the day I display my glory will be a memorable day for them, declares the sovereign Lord. Verse 14, people will be continually employed in cleansing the land. They will spread out across the land, and along with others, they will bury any bones that are lying on the ground. So the cleansing of the land is a big deal. We've talked about that some, about coming in contact with the dead, and how spiritually, how people are made spiritually unclean if they come in contact with the dead in any way. So everybody works at it here. There's a special people that are hired. We're going to see in verse 14, they're hired to do this. They're going to do this, and it's going to cover all of Israel. Okay, so they have to stop what they're doing when they run across bones. They bury them, and it says everybody's going to be involved. If you're there when they run across the bones, you're going to be involved with the process. Verses 15 and 16. Oh, I never did finish. The last part of verse 14 says, after the 7 months, they will carry out a more detailed search. So it's to give them a cursory look, looking for bones. They run across bones, they stop and bury them. And I guess they look around, see if they see any more. And when they can pass through, they go on their way. But later on, there's going to be another time slot set aside to do a more detailed search. They want to get the place really clean. So 15 and 16 say this: as they go through the land, anyone who sees a human bone will leave a marker beside it until the gravedigger is buried in the valley of Hinnom. And 16, near a town called Hamona, and so they will cleanse the land. So this detailed search goes on. Once the first part is done, if they find some later, if you're the one that found it, doesn't mean you have to bury it. You got to put a sign up that says, here's a bone. And these guys that are the professionals that are hired to do this will come along and bury the bones for part of the process of cleaning the land, cleansing the land. Okay. verses 17 to 26 have to do with the feast of Gog and the glory of the Lord. So let's look at verse 17. Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Call out to every kind of bird and all the wild animals, assemble and come together from all around to the sacrifice I'm preparing for you, the great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. There you will eat flesh and drink blood. Okay, here's a sacrificial meal, but Gog is the only thing on the menu. He and his army and all of his allies that were fought and killed. It's pretty gruesome to talk about this. They're eating flesh and drinking blood, but it carries you right square into verse 18, and that says, you will eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, as if they were rams and lambs and goats and bulls, all of them fattened animals from Bashan. Okay, so this is it's getting gruesome, really gruesome. And they're eating flesh of the mighty men, drinking the blood of the princes of the earth. So these are the leaders of the armies that were in there to do this fighting, and 5-6 of them, according to King James, 5-6 of them were wiped out. They were clobbered. That's just the way to put it. They were clobbered, and so there was a lot of dead bodies, and this is what's going to be fed. Okay, to the birds. Verse 19 says, at the sacrifice I'm preparing for you, you will eat fat until you're glutted and drink blood until you're drunk. So they're going to gorge. They're going to gorge on the dead bodies. Verse 20 says this, at my table, that's God's table, you will eat your fill of horses, talking about the birds. You eat your fill of horses and riders, mighty men and soldiers of every kind, declares the sovereign Lord. So chapter 38, we talked about the great hordes coming with large and small shields, large horses with riders. Can you imagine the sight of all these people? Some have been lying on the ground and probably nothing left but bones. I'm not even sure Israel had an army. They lived in safety for so long. So God did all of this against Gog, God's great army. He annihilated by earthquake, flood, hail, fire, fighting against themselves with their own swords. Now in verse 20, that God's table will be for the sacrificial meal of Gog's army. There's going to be a sacrifice made, and it's not Israel, it's Gog, and he's going to be sacrificed to the birds. All right, verses 21 to 24. Let's read that. Chapter 39. I will display my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay on them. From that day forward, the people of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God, and the nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sin, because they were unfaithful to me. So I hid my face from them, and I handed them over to their enemies. And they all fell by the sword. In verse 24, I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their offenses, and I hid my face from them. All right. God is going to lay his hand of judgment on the nations. And what they will know is that Israel went into exile because of their sin, which meant they were unfaithful to God. I dealt with them in the appropriate manner. The worst part, I hid my face from them. So that is a reminder of what happened when Babylon attacked Jerusalem and Israel. A note I wrote in my commentary is that the nations will know, but will they repent? The answer is no, they will not repent, and it's too late for them. But if you recall, I don't want to go back and look it up, but if you recall, back when we were studying the attack on Jerusalem and back in those chapters, it said that I'm doing this because of their sin and the way they act, their deeds, their lifestyle as it relates to God. That is why I'm doing this. Okay, that's why I was doing that, the Babylonian exile. Okay, now this war is going on, and what you'd like to say is, we talked a little bit about this last week, but what you'd like to say is it's going to be done in such a way that we know that God is the one that did it. Why would people not repent? Well, we know back over, I mentioned last week in Revelation, the rocks were falling on people and they hid in caves to avoid it. And it said that they knew that it was God that did it, and yet there's no mention of repentance anywhere. All right. Verses 25 to 29 is the epitaph of Gog's defeat. Okay, as we read through these verses, I want you to picture in your mind what was going on in the Great Tribulation, because what I have said is that the millennium follows the Great Tribulation, follows Armageddon when Jesus squelches that war. We have this 1,000-year reign, and then this war we're talking about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. I want you to picture what was going on in the Great Tribulation. All that mistreatment and genocide of the Jews by the Antichrist, and all that destruction and mayhem that was going on. Okay, these verses change the focus from the eschatological future to the beginning of the millennium and the second coming of Christ. We've been talking about the 1,000 years after the second coming. Now we're going to go back to the second coming, and God has got some things to say that are very important. So let's read there's in this summary in Ezekiel, he lists 7 purposes that God would achieve by establishing a new relationship with Israel. So let's look at verse 25. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I will now restore the fortunes of Jacob and will have compassion on all the people of Israel, and I will be zealous for my holy name. Okay, God, the word now, or therefore, depending on what translation you have, God initiates a new area of relationship with Israel. The second thing is that God had shown the discipline of love through chastening. Now he would show the compassion of love by restoring them. Okay, and the third thing I'd like to mention is that God would be zealous for his name and reverse the profaning of it, which went on for the centuries before. Okay, verse 26. They will forget their shame. This is very important. To me it is. They will forget their shame. It's very important for me in understanding when this occurs. They will forget their shame and all the unfaithfulness they showed toward me when they lived in safety in their land with no one to make them afraid. Okay, they will forget their shame and unfaithfulness. Okay, in chapter 36, verse 32, he told them to remember those things, remember and be embarrassed by their shame. as they're going into the millennium. That's what we were saying back then. The millennium was cranking up, and he told them, I want you to be embarrassed by all this. But this is saying, now that we're in the millennium, as we go through the millennium, I want you to forget those things. It's going to be, those are bygone days. Those are in our past. We're now looking forward. Okay? Then God will demonstrate the holiness, his holiness, through the regathering Israel from the countries of their enemies and establish them in the land. This happens at the second coming and the beginning of the millennium. The sixth thing I want to point out is that they will know he is their God when he returns every believing Jew to their own land. We talked about this last week, maybe even the week before, about this gathering, the regathering of the Jews. Is it going to be a supernatural regathering? And I've always been trying to figure out, how's God going to do that? Well, you can't figure out how God's going to do things, but he tells us how he's going to do it in Jeremiah 29 verses 13 and 14. I want to read through that again. We've read it last week and maybe the week before, but I think it's an important thing it's an interesting thing to know, particularly the wording. It's chapter 29, verses 13 and 14. Whoops, Jeremiah, not Ezekiel. All right, chapter 29 of Jeremiah, verses 13 and 14. How is God going to regather the people? Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. So there's going to be a time when they're looking for him. And it says in verse 14, I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile, which is their own land. So they're going to seek him. Things are going to happen. And we know what that thing is. It's going to be the second coming of Jesus Christ. We know from Zechariah that they're going to realize they crucified their Messiah, and they're all going to come to the Lord. They're going to seek him, and they're going to find him. So those verses said, I will be found by you. And it's through that seeking and finding process, God is going to know where they are, and he's going to gather them to their own land. And it says here in chapter 39 that he'll find every believing Jew. Let's look at what it says there in verse. Well, I hope I run across it. I'm having trouble finding that. We'll see if I run across it here. The seventh thing I wanted to say was God will pour out his Spirit on Israel as he promised. All right. Chapter 38 and 39 both stress the resultant revelation of the knowledge of God for both Israel and the nations. How many times he said, you're going to know I'm God. So the knowledge of God is going to increase. The knowledge of God, who he is the highest form of understanding of God. We have to know who he is. Not just what his name means, but knowledge of his capabilities and his will. It is a revealed knowledge, and he revealed it to Israel and the nations with the sword. That's a tough way to find out who God is. But God offers, second thing is that God offers salvation to individuals, to those who approach him with humility, repentance, and faith. He will provide a new spirit and a new heart. We saw that a couple of times in recent weeks. Even the evil of those who oppose him will bring glory to him. Whenever judgment comes, this is the third thing, even the evil of those who oppose him will bring glory to his name. Whenever judgment comes to the ungodly, his holiness and righteousness are established. We know that there will be a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. That knee will bend voluntarily or involuntarily. There's going to be some broken knees of people that refuse to repent and refuse to recognize God for who he is. But that knee is going to bow. All right. I'm still thinking about where it said, oh, there it is. It's the end of verse 28. What I said was up there that they will know he is their God when he returns all of them to their own land. And what I said was when he returns every believing Jew. At the end of verse 28, it says, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. He's going to know where they are, and he's going to bring them home. All right, I've enjoyed studying this chapter with you today. I want to thank you for studying with me. That's all I have for you today.